Hello and welcome to World Bank Live. I'm Paul Blake in Washington, D.C. In just 4 months, the coronavirus pandemic has dramatically changed lives around the world. For many of us, it's also changed the way we live. From quarantines to shelter-in-place orders, home-based work to canceled social gatherings, COVID-19 has upended everyday life like few crises before it. As many people have turned to their local supermarkets for food, one reoccurring image is that of empty store shelves. These images point to a potentially larger problem: the coronavirus's impacts on food supply chains, especially in developing countries and regions that face food insecurity. Here's World Bank Group President David Malpass explaining more when he spoke last week.
As the pandemic unfolds, disruptions in domestic food supply chains are emerging as a pressing issue in many countries. Many of you are aware, you're all aware of the locust crisis in East Africa, which is also hitting the food supply, and we've been working on labor shortages are becoming an issue affecting trade and logistics. The loss of income and jobs is reducing people's ability to even afford or buy food, and so we have a double problem of both the supply and the demand sides being disrupted in such a critical area as food and agricultural supply chains. That's to name just one part of this problem from the pandemic.
Just how widespread are these disruptions and how concerned should everyone be? To learn more, let's go live to Jürgen Vogele. He is the World Bank Group's Vice President for Sustainable Development. Jürgen, good morning. I want to kick things off with the big question. Empty supermarket shelves, they've been one of the defining images of this crisis. How concerned should everyone be? Is there a global shortage of food?
Hello and good morning, Paul. Thanks for having me on. We're not concerned about the global food shortage at this point. Fortunately, unlike the situation in 2008, when really the world food stocks were low and production was at risk, today we had record harvests over the last 2 years, and we actually have higher food stocks around the world than we've had in a very, very long time. So in aggregate, globally, we're not very concerned. Some shelves are empty in supermarkets, as you said, that is an issue. However, in supermarkets, I'm less concerned because I think supermarkets can deal with these changes in demand, these short-term changes in demand. Of course, people are buying more food because they're eating more food at home than they normally do, and they want to have a little bit of reserve in their shelves. But supermarkets generally can deal with this. So you have seen these images here and there, but they have not been very persistent.
So then is it simply, these empty shelves? Is this simply about panic buying, or is the pandemic disrupting the food supply chain in other ways, perhaps further up the line?
Well, so there's some of the panic buying, right? So all of a sudden, food demand increases dramatically in just a week or two, and supermarket chains have a bit of an issue trying to refill the shelves. But that's not really a concern. As I said, they can deal with it. And if you go to a supermarket today in most places, and certainly in advanced economies around the world, there really isn't a lot of empty shelves. So they can deal with that. Now, whether or not we will get major supply disruptions globally is a question, and it is a risk. So what we absolutely don't want to see is global export bans, trade barriers being imposed by individual countries, because if that begins to happen, then we may have a major problem coming our way. So one of the jobs we do at the World Bank, and together with colleagues and other MDBs, we just actually had a conversation this morning on this issue, and other actors in the space are all saying the same thing. Please, at the country level, let the food flow, and at the international level. Of course, we have inside countries other challenges, and we can discuss that.
Yeah, and I've definitely got some questions for you on that. We got another clip from the World Bank Group President David Malpass when he was speaking last week, where he's talking about some of these issues. If we'll just play that real quick.
What we have tried to discourage countries from doing is hoarding. There's a tendency in a crisis to hunker down, and I think it's a critical part of global cooperation to not do that, to look for teamwork with other countries.
Jürgen, governments are concerned about feeding their own citizens, and they've sometimes banned the export of some foods. Can you talk a little bit about you hinted at this earlier, can you talk a little bit about what's the lesson from history here on the effectiveness of that strategy?
Well, look, at times of crisis, there is a tendency among governments to be inward-looking and say, oh, well, we need to protect our own food supply, our citizens come first, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, what that does is if you aggregate it up, if several countries do that, you severely disrupt the flow across countries. And what we've learned in 2008, like 12 years ago, is when that happens, food prices shoot up. And then you will have a whole raft of things that come in its wake, including speculation. You need to understand that the majority of food is actually not traded internationally. So it's a fairly thin market, but those countries that depend on food imports from other countries, they depend on having the price, at a reasonable level. If these prices shoot up, particularly poor countries really get hurt. So the lesson we've learned is we've got to try to avoid this at all cost. And at the G20 at the time actually came together, learned the lesson after we had riots in more than 50 countries. Many of you will remember that. We learned the lesson and put in place what's called an AMIS, an Agriculture Market Information System, which the G20 actually this morning at the Agricultural Ministers meeting discussed again that this was the right decision to do. And this needs to continue going forward. It does remind everybody that that's key, that we don't disrupt the flows internationally.
For those of us that don't really remember, can you explain a little bit about what happened in 2008 and what were those lessons learned?
Well, so there are the key staple crops that, of course, countries are very concerned about to feed their population. Let me just use the example of rice. Rice is what's called a very thinly traded commodity. There's only a number of countries that produce rice in large quantities. There are fewer countries that actually export rice in significant quantities. Only 7 or 8% of the total rice consumption worldwide is traded. But the countries that need to buy the rice, of course, totally depend on that trade. So what happened is that a number of countries, I will not name them, major producers decided, well, there is a risk, there is high price, we better keep some of this rice ourselves and we don't export it. Then one country that's very dependent on rice import wanted to actually put a tender out for 100,000 tons of rice and could not actually buy the rice globally. So had a major food security problem. And the price of rice, which is usually $300-400 or maybe $500 a ton, went up to $1,400 a ton for that particular tender. So that caused all sorts of disruptions and riots. Just wanted to give you that sense. Now, are we in the same situation that we were in this last case? Not really, right? So as I said, the stocks at that time were low, so there was worry. The stocks are higher this time. Oil prices were high, so there was worry that the production cost would go up. As you know, right now, oil prices are very low. So there's also the biofuels issue that's not competing with food right now. So we are in a different situation. But if trade restrictions take place and to a significant scale, there's a major risk that prices will drive up. And that will hurt millions and millions of poor people.
Are governments listening to you when you make those warnings? Are they heeding those warnings when you make them?
Look, it's not only about us, right? I mean, we make those points, but so does everyone else in the space, whether it's the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome, whether it's other UN agencies, whether it's other multilateral development banks, a lot of bilateral partners are saying the same thing, because the lessons are very, very clear. We cannot repeat those mistakes. We have to try to avoid this at all costs. And yes, there has been some positive movement. A number of countries have actually listened to the call and have restrained themselves. A number of other countries in Latin America, for instance, agreed just recently not to do that. So there is positive news, but there are also signs that a number of countries are seriously considering going into that direction. So this is work in progress, and it is a significant risk.
If you're just tuning in, you're watching World Bank Live, and we're talking to Jürgen Vogele, the Vice President for Sustainable Development here at the World Bank, about the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on food supply chains. Jürgen Vogele, the next question I want to go to and get your insight on is that of that international trade in food. It seems like a lot of international air travel, so like passenger travel, has been severely cut back. Has that same sort of effect happened on freight, and what does that mean for the effect, or what does that mean for the trade in crops and food?
Well, so it's a factor, right? Air travel and air traffic and air freight is an important factor, but it's not necessarily an important factor for the main staple crops, which are usually the ones that are affected by these export restrictions or trade restrictions. Only very high value food, or let's say cut flowers, beans, strawberries, are going through air freight. So yes, the consumers will have less access to those. producers will be hurt if the trade is disrupted, but it's not a major concern when it comes to food security. Most of the food is transported through ships, and the ports are operating. There were some constraints. I think it's all in the news. There was some slowdown, but they do still function fairly well. Then, of course, you have the local logistics, which is a much bigger challenge in many countries. Truck drivers, for instance, in India don't want to drive because they can't have a restaurant on their way to eat because all restaurants are closed. So there are many very localized impacts on the logistics chain and the whole supply chain. So I think it's differentiated. I'm not really worried about the air traffic or the air freight at this point.
Earlier, you were making a bit of a difference between domestic supply chains and international supply chains. Can you talk to me a little bit about those domestic supply chains? Do we need to worry about those breaking down and affecting the supermarket shelves that we all sort of see?
Well, we certainly see more disruption in the local supply chains than we see in the international supply chain at this point. So the basic principles that I've laid out in the global space apply to domestically as well, right? So if governments try to keep the flow of food open, that's the best case scenario. But we've seen a number of governments that are not doing the right things to keep the flow of food going. And I think that's where the concern comes in, right? Whether it's checkpoints, whether it's social distancing, of course, which you need. But then in most countries, actually, food is seen as an area that should go ahead, right? It's excluded from the lockdown. But, when you're in a country where 60-70% of the population is involved in one way or another in the food supply chain, that's a very difficult thing to do. It's one thing to do it in Europe, where you 3 to 5% of the population ensure that everybody has food in the supermarket shelf and on the table. In some developing countries, that's not that simple. So I think to have these policies really thought through and facilitate the flow of food, particularly from rural to urban areas, is key going forward. And it's not quite as simple, actually, as what I laid out in the international environment.
I want to talk to you a little bit more about the kind of difference between sort of developed countries and developing countries. It seems like most of the cases of coronavirus have been in richer countries, but the issue of food security is bigger in developing countries. Can you explain that dichotomy a bit?
Yeah, well, we don't really know the numbers, of course, the actual COVID-19 numbers in developing countries because of all the things that are well articulated in the news. But why is it much more of a problem? Because if the food supply is disrupted, poor people get hurt, right? And there's a large number of poor people in developing countries that are right now either locked down or have no day job, can't move, don't have access to food. Even in rural areas, it's problematic. When 60 to 70%, as I said, of the population is involved in either agriculture production, small, medium enterprises, value added in the input supply chain, in the transport and the logistics into cities, and that all gets stopped, then people get hurt, and a large percentage of the population gets hurt. For poor people, food is a question of, is it available to me where I am, whether I'm in a slum or whether I'm in a city or whether I am in a rural area? Is it affordable? And, can I actually afford to buy it? And if 50 to 70% of your very low wage or very low income goes to food, and that gets disrupted, that's a big issue, right?
And so the other big kind of context I wanted to ask you about is the particular issues around fragile states. For example, states that have suffered from conflict and violence. What regions or situations concern you the most in that regard?
Well, as you pointed out, right, of course, the risk and the harm done to those who live in fragile states will be much, much higher than in other places. We already have 70 million people that are migrants, mostly internal. If those food supply chains are already very fragile at the best of times, right? And then you put on top of this the logistical challenges and other, it's just going to be very, very risky and very complicated. So there is a real fear that the number of hungry people could double. The number of people who are affected by this could double in the next few months unless we take the right measures. And there, of course, World Food Programme needs a full support from all of us and from the communities around the world, because they have the logistical capability to deal with these very extreme environments. But of course, also us as an institution, World Bank, we need to do everything we can to ramp up, double down on social safety nets and community development programs, on social funds, anything that basically helps stabilize these disruptions that are going on right now. And on top of it, puts cash into particularly poor people's pockets. So we're actually in the process of building up a very good program in this regard, which will go to the board within the next few days.
If you're just tuning in, this is World Bank Live. We've got Jürgen Vogele on the line. He's the Vice President for Sustainable Development here at the World Bank, and he's walking us through the impacts of COVID-19 and the pandemic on food supply chains around the world. Jürgen, next question I have for you is about the G20 Agricultural Ministers meeting. I think that's happening as we speak right now. You've been in on that call. It's an extraordinary meeting. What are you hearing, and why is kind of getting everyone together in a kind of collective action so important for food security?
Yeah, as you said, I listened in. It started at 8 o'clock this morning here, our time, and it is very clear that everyone in the Ag Ministers meeting is extremely concerned that if we don't do the right things now, we will not only have a health crisis, we will have a food crisis, right? And I think that's very strong messaging coming out from that meeting. And the number one issue is, again, as I said earlier, don't disrupt the global supply chains and do everything you can to maintain your local supply chains. And the ministers sort of one by one, I only could listen in for the first half hour, but everyone who spoke basically came out with that same messaging. And then really ramp up the social safety nets, try to get cash into people's hands, because you also want people to stay home. You cannot do social distancing if every smallholder farmer in Africa or in South Asia needs to get on the truck and put food on the fresh market into the city every day. Then the whole system doesn't work, right? So you need to help those people to be able to do that. Those are the kinds of messages that came out from the Ag Ministers meeting. And again, this call for global solidarity on this issue. We should not underestimate the risk that we're facing right now if we don't do the right things. Fortunately, I think right now everybody has that awareness, which wasn't there 10 years ago. So there was a good chance this will work.
So let's turn to the page here a little bit and look at some possible solutions. What can we do, as a global community, as the bank, to help the poorest and most vulnerable access the food they need here over the next few weeks?
So as I said, the key is to get cash into people's hands and to help them maintain access to the markets and to the supply, right, on both sides. So we as an institution are looking at it from actually 4 different angles. One is the immediate disease response. The other one is a macro fiscal and financial sector stability program, which impacts that food supply chain as well to the banks. If banks are not liquid, if banks cannot continue to perform, that will disrupt the supply chain severely. Then we need to look at small and medium enterprises. How do we support the millions of small enterprises? And when you think about it, every farm is a small enterprise, sometimes a micro enterprise, but even a smallholder farm is a business. They have many times loans, they need access to inputs, etc. So supporting that input supply chain and allowing them to continue to be a part of the market is absolute key. And then it's the social protection, CDD, and community development programs where we have actually, I didn't actually know that before, but in the last week, we scrubbed our entire portfolio in the institution. And it turns out we do more than 300 operations worth about $50+ billion as we speak across social protection, social safety net, community-driven development, and a number of other similar programs, reaching close to 1 billion people as we speak. So we have an infrastructure on the ground right now, even in very fragile environments where often government capacity is limited, where things don't work very well institutionally on the ground. These local self-help groups, producer associations, women's groups, et cetera, they have a structure in place. So we can inject additional cash over and above of what's going on already. But that way we can go to scale, and we can reach probably between 1 billion and 1.5 billion people in the next few months if we do this right.
And on that, and on the bank's response, the World Bank is making up to $160 billion in financial support available over the next 15 months to help address the COVID-19 crisis. Can you talk a little bit about how some of that money, some of those projects will work to address risks to food security and nutrition?
Right. So as I said, the 160 billion will go into 4 different areas. One is the immediate health response. We are looking at over 100 countries that are already getting financial support from the institution, from the group. Actually, even before the end of April, will be over 100. So that's a big chunk. Then there will be a lot of policy loans to help countries with their cash flow, how they deal with banks. I mean, the whole economy is basically crumbling. So there will be a lot of that happening. But what is very clear that as part of that package, the food system is a major part of the solution, of the answer and our intervention. What people don't know, many people don't know, is that actually the global food system is the largest employer in the world. It employs more people than any other sector. It's also the largest asset holder in the world. So you can, and it's extremely critical, as I said, to maintain the food system functioning together with the health system. Some other things can wait, but the food system can't. So this will be part of that response. And then, as I said, a big chunk will go into SME, small, medium enterprise support with block grants, cash support, the whole works. And then in the 4th pillar, as I already mentioned, social protection, social safety nets, really getting cash into the poor families and into their hands. That's sort of the way conceptually we look at the 160 billion. And the food system permeates certainly 3 out of the 4.
You're going to stay with me. We're starting to get some questions in from the audience. Evelyn Avalos wanted to ask you, how would refugees be particularly affected by a threat to food security?
Well, refugees are always at risk, right? And so it's always a very fragile balance how to support refugees. So and as I mentioned earlier, we do need to pay particular attention to this. Refugees are also very much at risk of contracting the disease and having major explosions and outbreaks in those environments. So we need to make sure that the way the help is done is building on the existing local structures. As I said, the Red Cross, World Food, the World Food Program, they are on the ground working with refugees, and many local governments have programs in place. What we can do is to support and really double the funding for these, because right now they are very much at risk.
And that sort of takes us into our next question from Aditya Gupta 285. And they ask, do organizations like yours, like the World Bank, partner engage with different agencies to mitigate risks of food security, especially when it comes to vulnerable communities? You've kind of just answered that, but maybe kind of expand on it a bit.
Absolutely, right. So, and of course, all of this can only happen in partnership. So many of our community development-driven programs are implemented through local NGOs. They're implemented through local self-help groups. There is many partners, thousands, as a matter of fact, who are involved in these operations. And it's absolutely critical that we continue those partnerships. So this is not something we can do as an institution ourselves, certainly not to that depth and to the scale that's needed. So partnerships are absolutely what we're looking for. We're actually also having a conversation now with the food companies at various levels, both multinationals but also local companies, to see what they can do, what kind of support they need to not cut off some of the contracts that they are having with the suppliers, because that's another risk. So yes, partnership is essential to all of this.
So finally, just as we wrap up, looking ahead to the future here, what can be done, what can we do to make global food supply chains more resilient to future crises?
Well, we've been struggling with climate for a good number of years in the food system, in the agriculture sector. The risks of producing food are increasing every year. And so we need to make sure that we have climate smart agricultural programs in place that are both in reducing risk, building resilience and adaptation to what's coming, but at the same time also become part of the solution. Because the food system, as many people may not know, is actually a huge part of the climate problem. We are emitting between 25 and 30% of greenhouse gas emissions in the way we produce and consume our food. So really focusing on that will build resilience into the system. The risks of food production will continue to grow because the risk of severe weather events is growing as we speak. That will not go away, but we need to be fast in adapting. So one good investment, and that's as a last point here, is to continue to double down on agricultural research. Things are changing so quickly, and farmers have to adapt rapidly, that we really need to invest a lot more to have climate smart crops that can deal with these challenges.
Jürgen Vogelé, thank you so much for joining us here this morning on World Bank Live.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Jürgen Vogelé is the Vice President for Sustainable Development here at the World Bank Group. If you're interested in learning more about the World Bank Group, its work, and how it's responding to the coronavirus pandemic, head on over to worldbank.org/coronavirus. In the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you again next time. Goodbye.